Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, your RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content, and before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so we have a pretty packed discussion of basketball topics for you today. So we'll start off with the Milwaukee Bucks, with the recent news from Chris Haynes and others that it sounds like Damian Lillard is going to be out for an indefinite period of time due to deep vein thrombosis in his calf, the blood clot situation, right? The same ones that happened to Wemby, to Brandon Ingram, I believe Asor Thompson, right, last season, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so uh, just and that's a really tough situation, obviously, for the Bucks because they had already kind of gotten to a point where they had started to slide, right? They're 4-6 in their last 10. Obviously, that includes the last couple of losses without Lillard because he had missed the last 4 games or so with a calf issue, right? Which we didn't know about, that it was tied to a blood clot, I guess. But this is a rough time for the Bucks now because obviously, we talk about the standings pretty frequently, and they've dropped all the way down to 6th in the Eastern Conference, only a half a game behind the Detroit Pistons. But obviously, that's not where you want to be, right? A couple weeks ago, they were 4, potentially closing in on the Knicks, maybe to sneak up and catch them in 3rd place. But instead, they're probably going to fall back now. And it's unfortunate, right? Because obviously, if you fall down to the 6th seed, right, you end up having to play the Knicks in the first round, and they haven't matched up well with them. Obviously, the first thing to kind of point out is hopefully Lillard makes a full recovery and gets back to playing at some point. I don't know if he'll come back this season. The reporting from The Athletic suggested that they're optimistic that he'll come back. Obviously, it's going to depend on, him and how he personally feels and, whether or not, I guess, him and the doctors feel like it's safe for him to play in return. I don't know. I wouldn't really expect it. I mean, of course, I could be wrong, but obviously that's a huge blow for the Bucks, right? Who would, like I said, had already kind of been struggling, right? Especially on the offensive end. And now you're kind of at a point where, Giannis, assuming he can, play the rest of the way, he's going to probably have to kind of carry them and backpack them to a lot of wins just to get into the postseason. And even then, it's going to be really tough because any of those teams that they play in the first round, whether or not it's the Knicks, the Pacers, or the Pistons, like, I think you'd prefer to play Detroit just because that's a less experienced team and they can probably match up with them fine. I mean, either way, if you're the other team, you don't really want to play Giannis for a 7-game series, assuming he's healthy, because you didn't have to worry about that last year. So it's not like he couldn't do it, but I think assuming Lillard either doesn't come back or isn't quite the same, that's probably going to put a cap on how far the Bucks can realistically go. Because prior to that, Lillard had been playing well. Of course, Giannis had been playing great, but the team as a whole still wasn't really looking all that amazing. They had some individual pieces post-trade deadline that were looking all right, but you still didn't necessarily feel that much better about them compared to how you felt before. Feels like more of a cost-saving thing, and now you just kind of wonder where they go from here depending on how the season ends for them, because it's not looking too great right now.
Yeah, it looks horrible. First of all, I think the main concern is going to be his health, going forward and things like that. Because I think, we do want to send out prayers for that because it's a crazy freaking situation. You do have to go on blood thinners. He's already, started that process. So the treatment is already underway. But, when you do remove, I think, Dame from the lineup, you do have to look at, well, who are they going to slot in?
Right.
I think it's been, Ryan Rollins as of late? So it's been Ryan Rollins, Giannis, Kuz. Yeah, Taurean Prince, Brooke Lopez, and then the guys off the bench is like Kevin Porter Jr., Gary Trent, AJ Green. I don't know. Like, that screams kind of first round exit, but at the very least, you do have Giannis Antetokounmpo, and that helps your ceiling and floor tremendously. But I think with a guy like Giannis, you either need a defensive backcourt or just better personnel around him. I think if you want to be a true championship contender, because that was the problem with the roster going into it. We talked about it in the offseason. I remember we got crucified on that short for a little bit, because Bucks fans were like, yeah, that's a bad take, but and not to rub it in this kind of situation, because that's not what we're trying to do. But at the end of the day, it has come to fruition in probably one of the worst ways possible. And I think if you are a Bucks fan, this is probably the worst thing that could have possibly happened, because honestly, we were still kind of waiting to see all right, well, what can this duo do? You know, like the thought process was you're bringing in Dame to make things easier on Giannis. People were comparing it to Shaq and Kobe. People thought that it was going to be, the next great NBA duo, and we haven't really seen it. We've seen flashes of it here and there, but not enough to, I think, really warrant anything. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. Because, like you said, they both played together a decent amount, and honestly, this season they've both played very well. I mean, Giannis has been playing well, anyways. But like Lillard last year wasn't quite as good, but this year he's been much better, and it still really hasn't led to a ton of success. Because, like we talked about, the role players around them are just kind of limited, right? And it didn't help that like this year they've actually taken a step forward on the defensive end. They've been one of the better defensive teams this season, right? They've been a top 10 defensive team for a while now, right? So like they're clearly a good defensive team. Um, but the problem has been more so on the offensive end. They've been kind of an average offensive team, which is not what you would have hoped for with those two guys, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the shooters around them. But like we talked about, a lot of the guys outside of those two players just have very limited skill sets that kind of just come and go, right? It's a lot of guys that are, kind of 3-point specialists that don't do a ton else. Sometimes they can attack closeouts, but again, those are role players, right? And those are on the less expensive side, right? Like a guy like Chris Middleton, had he been healthy and impactful, you'd miss a guy with a skill set like that because he can
100%.
do more than kind of spot up and sit in the corner and shoot. He can do some playmaking. He could defend, but that version of Chris Middleton doesn't really exist anymore, right? So that's why they dealt him, right? But the problem is Kuzma hasn't necessarily been much better, right? I mean, like obviously, yeah, he can get hot. He's a high volume scorer and he can, give you some rebounds and at least just give you more availability than Middleton, but it's just not enough to really make up for what you could have had Middleton been healthy. And they had to do it anyways. There also was a cost saving decision with this too. I think it got them out of the second apron, which just makes for a more flexible roster because we talked about it where we thought that core had probably kind of, missed the mark in terms of the window was probably closing. So they needed to make changes anyways. It's just like you said, we may not be able to see what Lillard and Giannis do in the postseason, right? Because of course he could come back, and again, the reporting suggests that they're optimistic about his return, but he would still have to ramp up physically. And this isn't, January where you still have a decent amount of time to
Mm-hmm.
go. This is, the end of March. We're getting into April. The playoffs are going to start in a few weeks, right? And that's where you kind of have to be at your absolute peak physically. And that's a lot to ask for a guy who, like you said, is currently on blood thinners and is trying to rehab and recover from a blood clot. Again, hopefully, if it's safe, he can come back and
Yeah,
play,
yeah.
and we'll see what the Bucks can do. I just, even if he's back to injury, I just have a hard time seeing this version of the Bucks team really being able to make a deep run. Like maybe they could get out of their first round series alive, right? Just depending on who they play, depending on who they match up against, but I just don't think they're quite good enough to be able to compete with a lot of the top teams, right? That, like especially mainly in the East, because I think some of these Western Conference teams maybe they could match up against, but then you kind of look and their record against winning teams is not really that good either, right? It's kind of Knicks-esque, right? In the sense of they're pretty good against teams with losing records, right? But against teams with winning records, they've struggled, right? And that's kind of one of the reasons why, that puts a cap really on how many games you can win, right? Like if you see teams like Boston, Cleveland, OKC, they don't lose to a lot of teams regardless of whether or not they're good or bad. That's why all those teams are, 55 wins or more essentially, right? Like I mean, two of those, I mean, OKC is already at 60 wins, but for a team like the Bucks, it just feels like they're a good team but not quite good enough to really, be able to be a true championship level team.
Yeah,
And
I
that
agree.
opens the door for after the season, regardless of what happens, what do they do? Is there really a way to realistically improve this team upon what you have? Right? Because I think Lopez will be a free agent. I'm sure a lot of the other guys that are on like 1 year deals or whatever, they'll be free agents. They don't really have a lot of young players to build around or, kind of add in and kind of
Mm-hmm.
replace some of those starters. They just don't really have a lot to
They
work with.
traded all them
So,
away, actually.
right. So that's kind of the question where I do wonder what happens, right? Like could we actually be getting to the point where maybe Giannis is gone? And maybe he's not, right? It's just obviously something to think about because I'm sure he wants to win, and I just don't necessarily think that this Bucks team is going to be able to do it,
Yeah.
right? And he's already 30, so again, he's still playing at a high level, probably one of the best seasons, if not his best individual season, but it just doesn't seem like it's going to be able to get done in the with this Bucks situation right now, and it's tough, right? Because they made the decision to shake things up by going after Lillard, and I don't think that was a bad decision. It's just like we've talked about, they weren't really able to, for one reason or another, really kind of get the right pieces around those two guys
Yeah.
to make it work as well as you could, and they haven't been healthy. That's the other issue as well, right? So, now it seems like potentially another lost season, but of course we'll have to see how it
Oh
goes.
yeah.
Yeah, and then speaking of another team in the Eastern Conference, although they're in a little bit of a different spot, the Pacers are 7-3 in their last 10. Just had a crazy game the other night, right between them and the Lakers, right, where it was pretty back and forth. In the first half, the Lakers looked really good. Then in the second half, the Pacers turned it up. Then it looked like the Lakers were about to close it out. Then they had a very strange last, minute of possessions, right, where they were just kind of conceding baskets, right? Then the Pacers had a brain fart, right, where they take Halliburton out, I guess, for defensive purposes, but then they get the stop, but then they run and don't call a timeout, so he's not in the game, and then they throw up a horrible shot, and then that gives the Lakers the opportunity for them, because they had their starters in, they didn't take them out, any of them out for defensive purposes. They got to run down the lane. Luka throws up a floater, misses it, and then LeBron tips it in for another game winner, right? So just again, kind of a funny game. And again, the Pacers have been playing well, and it feels like they may be on the verge of starting to replace the Bucks. Obviously, Giannis is Giannis, but again, you got to give credit to the Pacers and the Pistons as well for what they've been able to do. Because when we were talking about the Pacers earlier this season in regards to how poorly they were playing, but since that point, they've been much better on both ends of the floor too, right? And that's the nice thing because this season their league average defensively, but that's over the course of the entire season, right? When you kind of sparse it out to, the last 15, 20 games, they've actually been, like a top, a pretty good defensive team. So, that's kind of the nice thing about what we've seen from them as of late, while still being, good on the offensive end, right?
Hmm.
Not quite as good offensively as they were last year, but they're still a top 10 offense, and you'll take the improvements defensively, right? So like this is clearly a good team, even if there's still some weaknesses there.
Yeah, it sucks to lose this kind of game, but overall in their last 10, I think there's a lot to like. I think Halliburton's been solid. We already knew that Siakam was one of those guys that could be solid as well. But collectively as a unit, they're doing their thing. It seems like they've ironed out all the issues that were very present at the beginning of the season. Everybody's starting to ramp up, and I think this might be one of those teams where we kind of expect them to maybe elevate in the playoffs, at times. I don't know, but because it's kind of feeling a little bit similar to last year, in terms of what kind of situation they're headed for, like you said, replacing Milwaukee and things of that nature. So, I think you do have to, pat them on the back because they've been pretty good, considering that they did have some pretty bad injuries early on in the season, and they've definitely been able to overcome that, obviously. And, sometimes even in this game, like Halliburton, yeah, he had 16 points and 18 assists, but if you really break it down, like some of those shots, I don't know, they just weren't falling, whatever the case may be. But I feel like they do have I think they have a ceiling that it just doesn't give me a whole lot of confidence, in believing in them going past like maybe the second round or something like that. But I think
Mhm.
they're probably a lock for a first round, win, or maybe I don't know. It depends on who they end up playing, but it should
Yeah,
be
because it could
interesting.
be Detroit. Yeah, it could be Detroit or Milwaukee. It's probably one of those
Yeah,
two teams, assuming that they stay in that fourth spot because they could climb. I
yeah,
mean, we'll see what happens with the Knicks if they can hold on while Brunson's out, right? But it seems like worst case scenario, the Pacers will probably be four, unless the Pistons or the Bucks kind of make a last minute push because there's just not a lot of games left. I mean, most of these teams got like 10 games to go.
yeah,
So I mean, by the time you have 10 games left, a three or 2 or 3 game advantage in the loss column is kind of significant, right? I
yeah.
know they don't have the tiebreaker against Milwaukee, but So obviously they would need to stay ahead of them, but we'll see. Right. And then, from a Laker perspective, obviously just kind of a weird, funky game, right? Obviously they had been on a slide. Rui did come, back, and he was better in this game than he was in the previous couple of outings, right? And again, we've talked about them where we kind of just need to wait for them to get a little bit healthier, because it just kind of feels like this team kind of needs most of their guys at full strength to kind of look their best. And especially they need certain guys out there, or else it's going to look really ugly, right? Like, we're recording this before they play the Bulls, and Rui's going to be out, right? So obviously that could make them look a little bit different. They got, annihilated by the Bulls. If you want to kind of touch on them for a little bit, since they've been playing so well as of late. But, and then also I guess they added Jordan Goodwin to the roster, right? They cut Cam Reddish, gave Jordan Goodwin a contract. He'd been playing a lot for them. We'll see what that, how much he plays come playoff time. But, what do you think of these situations going on here?
Yeah, I mean, the Lakers one is interesting. I think, there's a lot to like, there's a lot to not like at the same time. Like you talked about the sliding and stuff like that. You need this team to be completely healthy. You need all personnel, all hands on deck for sure. But I think you do have to credit, when they are healthy, they look pretty freaking good. Like Luka looks very, very good. LeBron is in a less, I guess, stressful position, in terms of, having to carry the load offensively. He can kind of sit back and do the little things that I think people have never really credited him for throughout his career, but he's always done. It's just more magnified because he's not really the primary option anymore, which is cool. The elevation of Jackson Hayes, looking solid. AR, obviously, we already talked about that, best third option in the league. Like, there's a lot to love, but I think there are some glaring issues that I think kind of give you a bad feeling about how the team might do in the playoffs, because it seems like if one of their key guys goes down, they might be cooked for an entire series, or, defensively even. Like you talked about, very, very odd defensive situations, in this Indiana game, because it really seemed like Indiana was kind of just having it, but, like with a minute and 30 to go, you can't really give up easy 2 points like 3 seconds in the shot clock, and I think what I'm talking about, where it's like, how far can this Lakers team go, with the personnel that they do have. And obviously I think Luka's glaring defensive issues, like, obviously we already know that he makes up for it and some on the offensive end, but teams will hunt him. Teams will hunt that mismatch, and in the playoffs, what can you do to mitigate that? I'm sure they'll figure something out, but I think that's probably their Achilles heel. And then, with Chicago, hey, I think that's the best case scenario for them, because they're not one of those teams that's in the purgatory of tanking. They're not one of those teams that can really lose on purpose. I think you have to work with what you have, after trading away, some of your guys at the deadline, and then obviously, some of your guys in the offseason. I think, you feel pretty good about where the team has been. I think you love what you've seen from Mataz Buzelis, Josh Giddey, and I think it's a younger team. You have the younger pieces. Are they long term? Who knows? But for now, I think you feel pretty good about the return, because you didn't really get too much worse. You know what I mean? It's not like you didn't really lose out on any situations. Like Kobe White seems to be solid still. So, hats off to them, because I thought, they were cooked, but they're not.
Yeah, last 15 games for them, 8th in offensive rating, 11th in defensive rating. Of course, 15 games, and the latter part of the schedule in the NBA can get really weird, right? We've seen it time and time again. But it is funny, right? Because, we were talking about Levine, right? And how we thought it'd be kind of good to see him, right? Potentially on some type of team that could use him as a contender. And obviously it's the Kings, right? And he's like the Fox replacement. But, it just hasn't really been a great look for him. Not him personally, but just say like with the Bulls, right? They haven't really completely fallen off the map since they dealt him, right? And then obviously the Kings, I mean, he's not a better player than De'Aaron Fox, but just in general, it just is a rough look, right? Just but for the Bulls, again, like you said, like they're still probably not going to be in the playoffs, right? But I guess, but again, for them, for whatever reason, they've been kind of comfortable being in that realm of not being the worst team, but also, being like, I don't know, kind of like in the middle of the pack. But at least, like you said, at least they have some young pieces that you can feel better about foundationally, like, Josh Giddey, right? Like that was a point of conversation in the summer, right? Where most people felt like, if you're the Bulls, how could you do something like that,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where like obviously you would have liked to have gotten multiple firsts for Caruso, but if you can get this version of Josh Giddey, for X amount of seasons, you'll take it, right? If you're the Bulls, you can live with paying him whatever contract he is versus like if you're OKC, you couldn't do that because
Yeah.
you just couldn't really count on him probably doing something like that for them. But for a team like the Bulls that has like nothing to lose and nothing, concrete to really build around, it's fine and it's been working. And like you said with Buzelis, he's been really good for them. He's looking like a like a really good pick.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a guy that we talked about right in the draft where we felt like he was one of those guys where initially, right, going into when people first started doing these mock drafts, he was at the top of most
Top
people's
two.
lists, right? Yeah, exactly, right. And he had fallen because of the G League Ignite mess, right? And we talked about how those guys in the G League Ignite, maybe some of them haven't been quite as good as you would have hoped for, but you would at least factor in like they had some good intangibles, right? Like in terms of their athleticism and their ability to compete and everything else. And you're seeing that for Bucelis. Just the shot has to come around, and he's been shooting better. But once he gets that going, like he's probably going to be a really good player,
Oh yeah,
right?
big
In
time.
to the other guys that they have. So I'm sure if you're a Bulls fan, you're probably happy with what you've seen, so far, because at least you feel like I said, like you have some guys to build around.
Yeah, like they didn't take a giant step back, in trading DeRozan or what's his name, Zach LaVine. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah, it's just it's unfortunate that if you thought maybe they could have gotten more back, but maybe they couldn't. I don't know. But they also have a reputation for being kind of a I don't know a team that's just okay with being middling. But
Yeah,
at least they got some good young guys.
yeah.
Guess a couple of other stories, right? We did have, I guess, the matchup between Jimmy Butler and the Miami Heat,
Mm-hmm.
right? That ended up not really being quite as entertaining as you would have hoped, right? I mean, obviously the Heat ended up blowing out the Golden State Warriors. Obviously Steph didn't play in this game, so that's a factor as well. Felt like the Heat really wanted this game because they had been on a horrendous slide as of late. I think prior to that, I think they had lost 10 in a row.
Yes.
People did kind of bring up that Wiggins had missed the vast majority of those games, right? And in this game, he didn't really score a ton, right? He was 4 for 13, but he did have 2 steals, 3 blocks, 5 assists, 5 rebounds. I mean, it happens, right? Like Butler didn't have a good game. Most of the guys for the Warriors didn't really play well. Anyways, I think in the first half, all their starters had no more than 2 points each,
Yep.
which, just again, for them, they need Steph, right? Like when he comes back and plays, right, everything kind of works its way into place. It's just the concern is the 2 games that he's been out, they lost, and they lost pretty handedly. And now with those 2 losses, not that it's set in stone, but now they've actually dropped to 7th, right? Because the Clippers are 8-2, so 1 game better in the last 10 than the Warriors. They're tied, and the Clippers have the tiebreaker, right? Which, if you're the Warriors, that is not what you want, right? Where you're in a position where you could possibly be in the play-in, and then obviously they're half a game ahead of the Timberwolves, who could have actually been ahead of them too. But the Timberwolves decided to blow away a couple of games that they probably should have won. So I mean, again, it happens, right? Like I mean, the Heat shot really well in the game. The Warriors just were horrible in this game. It happens, but it would have been nice to have kind of seen a more entertaining game, just given, former team. He did get some cheers before the game, and then after that, he was booed the rest of the way. You kind of expected it, but didn't really seem like there was any love lost, I guess, in terms of like, the other team, right? It just feels like those relationships might have soured, but kind of whatever. It is what it is.
Yeah, I expected this to be one of those games where, a fire was lit underneath, Jimmy and he was just going to pop off, but that was not the case. And with the Warriors, like you said, they weren't fully healthy. You need Steph. We already know that. We know how good the team is when he is on the floor, and we know how bad they are when he's not. And that's unfortunate, I guess. But I think you do expect a little bit more out of Jimmy in this situation. But at the same time, you really can't hate on it too much, I don't think, because at the end of the day, it's one regular season game. But the problem is, one regular season game for one team can mean something completely different for another. Like to the Heat, this is just another day, another dollar, whatever the case may be. But then with the Warriors, like this is kind of do or die in terms of your seeding. And I think if you're the Warriors, you never want to be in a situation where another team kind of holds all the cards into what you're going to be doing in the postseason. Like you never want to be in a situation where another team has a tiebreaker over you or whatever the case may be. So they got to kind of lock in and kind of hope that they really survive. Beyond when Steph or before Steph comes back. I think that's kind of their key to victory there. But I don't know. Even in the game, like just weird stuff from the Warriors just seemed like they were completely gassed. They really didn't really give two craps, honestly.
And it's funny because, there was a stretch where all the teams in the West were winning at the same time. Then they kind of now are on a little bit of a stretch where they started losing. Now some of them have, kind of gone back to their winning ways, right? OKC's really the only team that just doesn't lose. I guess Houston was 9-1 in their last 10. But, that's the tough part, is that I think there's probably also a fatigue factor, right? Because they've had to play pretty hard on both ends of the floor. They're a small team, and they've had to do it every night to try to get into the playoffs, right? Because when the trade first happened, they were on the outside of the play-in looking in, right? And now they're right there on the cusp of locking in a playoff spot. It just hurts to lose these type of games to those type of teams, right? That like even without Steph, you feel like you should beat, right? Like you should probably beat teams like Atlanta and Miami, but you could also make the case that those teams have a lot to on the line as well, right? Because like say for the Hawks, they don't really, even without Jalen Johnson, they don't want to lose a ton of games. They don't have their own pick, right? It goes to the Spurs. So the last thing, if you're the Hawks, that you want is to give the Spurs a lottery pick. The Heat are in the play-in as the 10 seed, but let's say they had a horrific stretch, but let's say they close it out on an okay note. I mean, they could move ahead of Chicago. Maybe they could catch Orlando, although Orlando's been playing better. So we'll see. But that's the tough part of when you make a trade at that point in the season and you were already kind of in a decent hole, it takes a lot to get out of it because you have to win every single game. And like you said, one game for one team could mean something to another team, and one loss for one team could set you back, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's not the end of the world because they could win a bunch of their games after Steph comes back, and then they stay, in the top 6. But like you said, they're going to need a little bit of help from some of these teams ahead of them if they want to move up in there, right? Because and then they kind of need to hope that a couple of these teams maybe lose a few more games just
100%.
to kind of separate themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Also had another, funny situation with LeBron, right? Where, he was on the Pat McAfee show, right, for about an hour or so, right?
Hour
where
15.
He gave, hour 15, gave a lot of really quality content, right? Where, he, was talking a lot about, I guess his relationships with different, reporters and journalists and whatnot. Also some other conversations as well, right? And it was funny, right? Because he's usually been a guy that doesn't normally kind of just go after and take shots at like a lot of different reporters, but he did in this case, and it wasn't really like a shocker in the sense of like you don't really you don't feel bad about it, right? Just given the situation that had happened between him and Stephen A. as of late, right? Of course, we all know what has happened, right? Where he mentioned the thing about his son, right? Mentioned him as a father, and then he came after him in the Knicks game, and it's just kind of just been a bizarre series of situations since then, almost like a comedy show or something like that, right? And then of course after his tip-in game winner, right, against the Pacers, right, then LeBron goes on Instagram and reposts the video. I think what is it of like Stephen A. boxing,
doing
or whatever,
a sparring match,
yeah, exactly, or whatever that was. And again, he gave a lot of really good content. Like he even mentioned, how I think him and Jordan and him and Kobe really didn't have that much. Like he and Kobe didn't have much of a relationship until after Kobe had retired, right? And he felt the same way, I think, with the Jordan situation as well, right? Where it's like they probably won't talk a ton, right, until after he retires, right? He mentioned Stephen A. Smith was on like a Taylor Swift tour, right, where he was just kind of going anywhere and everywhere talking about his side. He talked about Windhorst as well. Also, Windhorst didn't really take the same route that Stephen A. did, right? He was, more, he was a little bit more measured, and what he was talking about. Yeah, like he mentioned, quote, this guy who says he's my best friend, these guys are just weird, right? um, yeah, because I think they attended the same high school, but
Yes.
not at the same time, though,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So I think that's kind of the, I think that's kind of the gap there, right? And I think he's broken or talked about, a lot, LeBron a lot in some of his reporting, but hey, some of that stuff, it happens, I guess, right? And then he mentioned the Luka trade. And he was clearly pretty excited about that. And he talked about obviously the shock that Luka had gone through, right? Obviously, in terms of getting traded, right? Because he was on a team where it seemed like it was his franchise, right? He had gotten comfortable. Then he gets traded, and now he's in a completely different situation, right? And again, he's taken a step back and has kind of just let Luka just kind of do his thing, right? It hasn't really been, a scenario of like, him kind of just trying to monopolize. And like you
Right.
said,
Right.
it's a lot of, kind of doing the other stuff as well. They still have some kinks to figure out. Um, it was also kind of also a conversation about, because there had been other players. I think like Rodman was one, right, who had mentioned like, oh, if he played in our era, he
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't even score, like 15 points a game
Mm-hmm.
or whatever it was. And he even mentioned Giannis, right? Like if you put Giannis in the 70s, he would easily score, 150,000 points,
Yeah.
right? Just because, again, the size, the physical advantage, while still having skill and all that. It's always a funny conversation, right? Just kind of putting current players in previous eras and seeing what they could do. They would all probably be really good,
Mm-hmm.
right? So a lot of really good stuff in these interviews. He gave a lot of great content, for any and everyone, right? Like regardless of if you're a fan or not, you got plenty to talk about, which is awesome and it's hilarious. He's also going to bring back the Mind the Game podcast, right? And Steve Nash is going to be his co-host this time, right? Because Reddick can't because he's coaching the team, right? So I guess there's a conflict of interest there, but a lot of really cool stuff. And it kind of goes back to, he mentioned a little while ago, right, that he felt like he was not very happy with the way that the NBA has been covered, right, in terms of the topics they choose to talk about, the things that they kind of choose to cover over other things. And we've talked about it, right, where, you feel like it would be nice if there was kind of more of a conversation and a discussion, about more of the basketball aspect of it than kind of the side, drama stuff, right? But for whatever reason, that does seem to be a draw. It seems like that's what ESPN wants to do, right? And it does draw in ratings, it does draw in attention, and it draws engagement. It's just kind of a disappointment because, there's a ton of stuff like, say on our show, we tend to try to talk about, a lot of these other teams, even if, even if it may not necessarily help us in the algorithms because they deserve, to be discussed and
Yeah.
talked about. But at the same time, it's a business, right? They're gonna, they're in it to make money, so they are trying to do what's best for them. It just doesn't feel like a good look. It doesn't seem like anything's really gained from it. But I guess you do get the attention.
Yeah. I mean, overall, it was a pretty good
Yeah,
episode. I
the
think,
LeBron part was great. Like I have no issues with what he did. I just want to make that clear. I have
Yeah.
no issues with what he did and he easily could have taken a blowtorch to other people, and he didn't.
Yeah. And I think he chose the best platform to do so. Pat
Yeah,
McAfee's show is kind of like all hands off. There's no real rules, I guess. It is funny that he
right.
chose an ESPN platform, well, an
Yeah,
ESPN owned platform in quotes, to take shots at other ESPN people. Freaking hilarious. But I
yeah,
thought the guys who moderated the conversation and facilitated it, obviously they did a good job, kind of just letting him go free and take the conversation
yeah,
wherever he wanted to. I think it provided a lot of insight on his personal life and also topics that I think we wanted to hear because I mean, these are kind of sometimes conversations that, everyday NBA fans have. Like there's always discourse
yeah.
about drop so and so in the 80s, 90s, wherever, and they're going to ball
Mhm,
out. But then, people have all these stipulations. It's the craziest thing ever. But at the end of the day,
mhm.
like it's really cool to hear his perspective on life in general and even his own personal life because you don't really hear him talk about his personal life. I think in that aspect and in that scope, so raw. I think it was super raw. It was super genuine too. And, I think it's just overall great journalism, great reporting, great entertainment as well. And, they addressed everything. They weren't really afraid of anything. They they addressed all the elephants in the room, the perspective on the Luka trade.
Mhm.
Like you said, the whole Stephen A and somehow Windhorst got roped
Yeah.
into it. But you know,
Mhm.
it is kind of, it was interesting to see it all unfold like that. And, I think at this point in his career, that's kind of what he needs to do. And I think people are going to enjoy that, hearing him talk. Because I'm sure he has plenty, thousands, maybe even millions of stories, that he could, you
Right.
know, um, tell the public on plenty of talk shows, probably his own that he'll probably eventually start once he's retired. But I think it is cool that, you know, he was in Indy that day,
Yeah.
went on the Pat McAfee show, because that's where they're based, if you didn't know, and then hit a game winner on the home team. It's just amazing. But yeah, everything I loved about it. And yeah, I had no problem with anything that he did.
Right.
But I do have a problem with the way that ESPN responded. I don't know what those guys were on. I don't know if you
Yeah.
watched the clips in the segment, but
Right.
Perkins, I
Yeah.
think he brought Stephen A. brought on like Kendrick Perkins. It was just blatantly weird. You could tell it's definitely personal. There's definitely some bitterness going on from a certain side, but
Yeah.
it is what it is, bro. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
no, I get it. And again, like the unfilteredness thing is what makes it really cool. Because
Hmm.
again, like we've talked about it, right? Where he for most of his career, like obviously, like yeah, there may have been times where maybe he might have taken a shot at a reporter, but it usually wasn't like just because, right? It
Yeah.
was like usually for something specific. Like I think his second time in Cleveland, right? They had the report that had came out, right, about him wanting to trade for Melo, right? And like Love would have been in the deal, right? And this was like after that Wizards game, right? The LeBron banked in
Don't
game winner
remind
or
me,
whatever.
bro.
Yeah, and he mentioned, like, yeah, the report is trash, and the guy that wrote it is trash too for putting something like that out there. It was like a week or two before the trade deadline, right? But in general, he doesn't usually do that, right? And I guess there's probably a level of like, because how many more seasons does he have left? Right. So it's like it's no holds barred. The gloves are off. Now we're kind of coming for a lot of these people. And it's kind of like, now the shoe's on the other foot, right? Because, there are a lot of sports personalities who do kind of go after and take shots at players for one reason or another. And again, they're public figures, so that stuff happens. But now it's like, what would the situation be like if the roles were reversed?
Yeah.
And the answer is kind of what you would expect, right? Where then they have a problem with it,
It's so
right?
funny
And
how
then they
defensive they get, though. That's the
right.
that's
So
the part that throws me completely left, because it doesn't make sense, right? Because if say a guy like Stephen A comes for a player or whatever, and if that
right.
player responds back, it's the end of the world. Especially if they do it in a certain way that isn't, I
Right.
guess, kosher. You know what I mean? And it's
Yeah.
it's just funny. I mean, we've seen people do it like KD on the internet,
Right.
but I think on the internet versus doing it on a highly regarded, very popular show is very, very
Mhm.
different. And I think I have to applaud LeBron for that, because I don't think people would be as, I guess, entertained with it if it
Right.
was on the internet. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like yeah, it would have been more of a bad look for LeBron if like Stephen A had just said it like I don't know like personally and like the clip just went viral. You know what
Yeah,
I mean?
yeah.
Like if it wasn't on his show or either of his shows, it may have looked more bad. Or again, if it had not been a personal comment, right? If it had not been a personal comment from Stephen A, then and if he had just said like, yeah, I don't think Bronny's that great, right? And then LeBron goes after him, then it would look more bad for LeBron,
Hmm.
right? But then when it was personal, right, then it's like, yeah, most people are going to take his side for it, right? And that's just kind of how it goes at this point. It just kind of stinks that again that is a lot of NBA discourse, unfortunately. When it would be nice if it wasn't, but
Agreed.
it seems like there are a lot of people who do like the drama, and like some of this stuff, like we laugh at too, right? But we also try to kind of balance it out by also making sure that we also talk about the basketball as well, because at the end of the day, this is a professional basketball league. So the basketball ideally should come first.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So, um, and it's funny, right? Because, now we are, and the great thing is we'll have a lot of stuff to talk about because we're getting close to the end of the regular season now. Again, like most of these teams are 70 plus games in. And, we'll probably have, some episodes coming up where we'll be talking about some of the end of the regular season stuff. We don't want to, spoil it and give it away because we want you to watch it, right? But obviously, there'll be plenty of things to talk about, right? As we get to there, right? It's just kind of wild ride. It seems like it kind of came and went in a
Yeah.
sense, right? Like it went by really quickly. Now obviously we're in the throes of March Madness, right? So now people are talking about some of these young guys that might come in We're not going to discuss those guys just yet, right? We'll probably get to the end of the tournament before we start talking about
Mm-hmm.
that. But we do have a couple of news and rumors, I guess, to discuss before we kind of get out of here. So it does sound like that the NBA salary cap will increase by 10%, right? The league cap projected to be at 154.6 million. And again, is it a ton? Maybe not, but again, like the thing is that we've talked about with the new CBA, like you're not going to have that giant cap spike that you had, say, back in what was it, 2016, right, where the cap space spiked like by 20 million, and then that's how you got KD going to Golden State, stuff like that, and then that's how you got a bunch of guys that got paid a lot of money who probably shouldn't have been paid.
Mm-hmm.
So they changed that up. But remember, this offseason, there's not a lot of teams that have a lot of cap space, right? Like Spot Track right now estimates that only really 11 teams could probably get under the cap. And even so, there's only about 3 teams that are going to have more than 20 million cap space, 20 million in cap space or more, right? The Pelicans, the Pistons, and the Nets. So, you wouldn't necessarily expect a crazy free agency. Not like a ton of free agents necessarily, anyways. A lot of those guys will probably just go back to their own teams, right? But either way, just kind of an interesting note.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always good. It's kind of like the ebb and flow of economy. I think it only makes sense. Everybody knew it was coming. I don't think people knew, obviously, what the number was going to be. But, I think it's solid enough to the point where, it allows, I guess, teams a little bit of flexibility, but not, not free reign.
Right, exactly. And then just a couple other little tidbits. So according to The Athletic, teams will try to poach Jackson Hayes, right? So we've talked about, right, him kind of stepping into the center spot for the Lakers, right? And obviously they didn't pull off the Mark Williams deal. So again, this kind of ties into there's not a lot of teams with cap space, but could a team give him like, I don't know, 6 million, 7 million or something like that? And then maybe they feel like it's too, maybe they don't want to pay that, because I don't know. I mean, if you're the Lakers and he doesn't cost a lot, you might as well bring him back, right? I mean, he's on a minimum contract and this is his second year. So I think they have the early bird rights where you can give him a little bit of a raise. He could get more. I guess the main question is, do we expect him to be back in Los Angeles next season, regardless of whether or not he's the starting center?
Depends on the postseason. That's what I would say. I think, that's the perspective and the lens that I would look at it. Because, yeah, I think everything is going to contend on, well, how good are you going to be in the postseason? Can you be a starting caliber center? Me personally, not long term, but for right now, I think he's done a very good job of, kind of being there, fitting in, being that lob threat, and also showing some flashes defensively as well. But, I could see like a team like Brooklyn kind of just being weird and offering him, a decent amount of money for no reason.
Yeah, him and Claxton.
Yeah, right, exactly. Like sheesh.
Yeah, yeah, just kind of a funny situation. And then also according to Shams Charania, right, we got some reporting a couple hours before we got on about Gary Payton II. Guess we could also, if we had wanted to, talked about this in, when we were talking about the Butler thing, but it sounds like he has sustained a torn ligament in his left thumb, and so he's going to be out. I guess they basically said for some time, indefinitely. So that's a pretty significant loss, I would say, for Golden State. It's not the complete end of the world because it's not one of your, 3-4 best players, but he does have an important role because he is kind of the main guy that they put out there for, like perimeter defense, point of attack. He's a good athlete. They kind of use him as a 5 a lot of times offensively, right? Where he's rolling, either as a short roller or just straight up rolling to the rim, gets putbacks, dump off guy. Because, obviously we've talked about him multiple times before, but it's rough because this is the third straight season, I think, where he's going to miss extended time for this team. And they don't really have like an obvious guy to replace him, right? Because like when you look at the guard spot, I know he doesn't necessarily play the guard spot, but like when you look at their other players who, are capable of being point of attack guys, they don't have a lot of those type of guys outside of him, right? Like, when you look at the rotation, like Steph, Pods, Buddy Hield, those are their other guards. Those aren't really POA guys, right? And obviously for Steph, that's your superstar. You don't want him being, also the primary defender for other guards. I guess you could maybe size up and just say, all right, Moses Moody, you're going to guard guys. I think he's a little bit better guarding up. or maybe you could use Kuminga, but he just hasn't really taken that many strides defensively either. So, until he comes back, it is a tough loss. Are they going to just lose a ton of games without him? Probably not, but I wouldn't be surprised if all of a sudden they start playing some teams with some good offensive guards and they start kind of lighting it up because they just don't really have a great alternative after that. It is a loss that will hurt them, but I don't think it's something that will make or break their season, especially if he can come back. But he is a guy, unfortunately, that picks up a lot of injuries.
Yeah, he actually does a lot on the floor. You already talked about it. He's like a hybrid guy on offense, but definitely defensively, I think is where he truly shines. And does all the little things. Will probably guard. Some of the best perimeter players in the league. So he will definitely be missed because I don't think they have somebody who can really replace him. I know that sounds kind of crazy to say for a role player, but hey, when you're of that caliber, I think it's hard to replace him.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the tough part of, because he's another one of those guys that really benefited from the Butler trade because they were asking him to do more than he was probably capable of
Yes.
doing. He wasn't shooting that well, but he's been playing much, much better since the Jimmy Butler trade.
Yep.
It's a downstream effect. But, like you said, it doesn't seem like it would be that much of a loss, but I think it will be just because again, they're a defense first team. So they need all their defensive guys ideally if they want to make a deep run, especially because they don't have a lot of size to really, make up for that, right? Like
Yes.
there's not, like obviously Draymond and Jimmy Butler, those are the two main guys that are kind of holding it down defensively in the back, right? But, it's just Peyton is your perimeter guy, right? So it's like, you got to get past him first. And if you get past him, then you get to those guys. But then if you don't have Peyton, you're probably going to have more overhelping. You're probably going to have more blow bys. And I just think it may be a little bit more problematic. Again, is it the end of the world? Maybe not necessarily, but we've seen when he's gone for a while, like their defense doesn't necessarily look the same. Because, like I said, especially on the perimeter, like the other areas of the floor may be able to hold up, but it wouldn't surprise me if they looked a little bit worse on the defensive end. And again, they need it, right? Because, they've been much better on both ends of the floor, anyways. But we know where they're at their best is defensively,
100%.
right? Because outside of Steph and Jimmy, you don't have a lot of great offensive options, right? That is kind of one of the weaknesses of this team, where again, their defense needs to be on point if they want to be able to make the run. Because then, obviously, if it's a low-scoring game, you can say like, all right, Steph, you can score 10 or 12 quick points in the quarter, and then we're on our way, right?
Yeah.
But obviously, in order for it to be that, you do need, I think, most of your defensive guys present.
For sure, yeah. And I think that's where Kuminga comes in, and it's like, well, can you be our offensive guy? I don't know. That's where I'm like,
right?
How far can the team go?
Exactly. And that's, like we said with the Lakers, that's kind of the tough part of these teams that made these trades at the deadline, where they are clearly better. They are, title contenders. It's just, again, are they going to be able to match up, with these other teams, that are, that already started off the season playing great and are still playing great, right? Because, we can talk about it in the next episode, obviously. But if you haven't noticed, right, Boston's been turning it up, right? Cleveland's gone back to winning, and OKC just never loses anyways. And those teams, those three are kind of the cream of the crop right now. Is there a way for any of those other teams to be able to match them? Maybe, but I think they're going to need a lot more things to go their way if they want to get there, which we already knew.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts on all these topics that we've been discussing, right? The Lillard injury that could potentially, cost him and the Bucks their season. Let us know your thoughts about maybe teams like the Pacers and the Bulls, right, who've been playing really well. Let us know about the Lakers. Let us know about the LeBron Stephen A rift, or anything else, right? Let us know in the comments. If you leave a comment, we'll read it at the end of the video. Also, continue to like and subscribe to help the channel grow, and share the videos, right, so that way everyone can see it. And we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.